Step into My Garden by Frank Belknap Long. Although Kendrick had walked home from the station with a golf bag slung across his back, he looked and felt cool. It was a lovely June day, and up and down the neighborhood, skewerwood trees were in full luscious bloom. He had a feeling he might find this homecoming the best yet. The garden would be blooming, and Anne would have a new hairdo. She was always surprising him by making little adorable changes in herself. He set his luggage down in the vestibule and fumbled in his pocket for his keys. In all the years he had known her, she had never been the same woman twice. He was lucky to be married to a girl who knew how to rearrange the little intangibles which made a man feel that his home was an intimate part of himself. Anne never failed to make changes in his absence, putting a new vase here, a floral innovation there, moving the piano a little, trimming down Scotty till he looked like a ludicrous old man, and even sprucing up his library by adding new titles and dusting down the shelves. Even in the winter months, Anne made changes, so that when he returned from brief frosty trips, he'd find the logs in the fireplace crackling under a new and better updraft, or a pair of fur-lined lounge slippers substituted for the leather ones he had left by his chair on his way out. But now he felt in his bones that he was about to experience something which would make this particular homecoming unique. Spring was the season of changes, and he had been away 3 full weeks. He was not disappointed. As soon as he threw open the front door, a change came floating toward him, which stopped him in his tracks. It was an odor, a fragrance, as of new-mown paradise, gathered up in porous sacks and hung up in front of an electric fan, which had wasted no time in wafting it around about. For a moment, Kendrick stood motionless, his nostrils quivering. Then he whipped out a handkerchief and mopped his forehead. He no longer felt cool. The house was humid, damp, and the perfume seemed to collect on his face, stifling him. It was the sweetest fragrance he had ever inhaled, but also the most cloying, so that he found himself struggling for breath. He pulled himself together with a jerk. If his wife was alone in the house with that perfume, he'd better do something about it. "Anne, I'm home," he called, and stood waiting for her voice to come downstairs to him. He waited in vain. No human sound answered him, but he did hear little pattering footsteps descending the hall staircase. Scotty, he thought, and flexed his knees to cushion the bounce of a little black friend against him. There was no bounce, because it wasn't a dog. It wasn't anything that he could see. It pattered down the high, dark stairway, swished around his legs, and went scampering out and back. The best part of Kendrick's home was out and back. Out and back was a book-lined study where he spent his mornings reading, writing, and listening to Anne moving about in the kitchen. From out and back there came the noon odors of cooking, snatches of birdsong, and gentle clickings as Anne opened and closed the huge new refrigerator which she had purchased impulsively back in February. Anne had made the down payment out of her household savings, and left him only the installments to worry about. He wasn't worrying about household expenses now, however. His heart was hammering against his ribs, and a sickening dread had come into him. Something invisible that scampered was loose in the house, and he lifted his golf bag through the front door and wedged it into the umbrella rack at the foot of the stairs. "Anne!" he called again loudly. Up above there was only silence. Striding through the long house to his study, he kept clenching and unclenching his hands and dampening his lips with his tongue. Time seemed to stand still while he did this, and when he arrived out and back, he felt as though an eternity had passed over him, filling his mouth with dust. He tore through the study to the kitchen without stopping to search for changes in the big sunlit room. The kitchen hadn't changed. Everything was drenched in sunlight, and everything was in place. The electric clock above the stove was swinging its red minute hand around in a needlepoint crawl. The refrigerator was humming gently, and the radio by the window was dialed to McCabe's Food Hour, which was Anne's favorite kitchen program. Kendrick turned his gaze about in a rotating scrutiny, which was as reassuring as a tour of inspection could have been. All about him were little boy blue things, dutifully awaiting Anne's return. He put up a hand to his face. His skin was clammy cold. Well, that was just too bad, because he wasn't feeling that way now. He had gotten a grip on himself by pinning a half Nelson on the squirming part of his mind. He was sure he knew now why his neck hairs had risen out in the hall. He had stepped from bright sunlight into the house, and the rat had scurried past him so rapidly that his eyes had drawn a blank. Sun-dazzle and too much imagination had turned a big, frightened rat into an infinitely more terrifying thing. It chilled him to realize that the house was infested, but rats could be gotten rid of easily enough. A little arsenic mixed with ground glass scattered around would do the trick. The fragrance was overwhelming now. It filled the kitchen with an urgency which drew Kendrick irresistibly toward the garden. It was coming from the garden, of course. The kitchen door was ajar, and he could see a thin sliver of the garden which he and Anne had planned together. It was a beautiful garden, filling the entire backyard, and his neighbors with envy whenever he took them out and showed them what malt dustings, root prunings, and night soil testings could do. Anne had evidently introduced some new and odoriferous bloom, which was flooding the house with the fragrance which was too cloying for comfort. This time she had made a change which was regrettable, a change which... His brain became a cake of ice, freezing his thoughts solid. He had thrown open the kitchen door and was staring out over a garden in full bloom, a garden in which bright-petaled plants cascaded over one another in such riotous profusions that the entire yard seemed a mass of purple, green, and vermilion flowers. Only it wasn't his garden. It wasn't his garden at all. Gone were the yellow-pink moss roses, snapdragons, everlastings, red cardinal climbers, and dwarf ageratums which he had set out back in May. Gone, too, were the bush fruit trees and cleft-grafted shrubs which he had shortened back and syringed with tobacco water earlier in the year. There wasn't a flower in this new garden which was familiar, not a flower which he could name. The blooms were so bright they dazzled his pupils and made his throat ache. Standing in the midst of this garden was a pot-bellied little figure scarcely 3 feet in height. His hands were locked around a long-handled rake, and he was staring at Kendrick from beneath the brim of an old straw hat, his eyes squinting against the sun. Kendrick experienced a sense of being not himself. It was as though someone who lived right at the intersection of Not Real Boulevard and Nowhere Avenue had stepped into his shoes and was using a wax impression of his brain to think with. The wax kept melting and running out of his ears, so the experiment was hardly a success. He heard the someone say, "Who are you?" but he could only catch snatches of the little figure's petulant reply. "Hired me. But honest, mister, I never figured the Nors. In a garden like this, you gotta expect shants and digleys, but Nors are something else again." "Nors?" "Not often do they have Nors. They must have been here all along. You've got 'em upstairs and down now, I bet, scampering through the house and making hay while the sun shines. Mister, look, with Nors chewing at the roots, how can I—" Suddenly Kendrick was himself again. The change in his garden outraged something deep inside of him, which rose up with swinging fists and clouded the jeebies out of his brain. His eyes blazing, he strode down to the little figure, bent over, and dug his fingers into... nothing at all. Where the dwarf's shoulders had been, there yawned only empty air. Waist and legs faded out more slowly, but faded they did, leaving only a filmy face suspended in the air. The face vanished with a swish so quickly that the air about it quivered and backed up against Kendrick's vest. For a moment it seemed to blow over him freezingly. Kendrick's teeth were chattering when he went back into the kitchen and mixed himself a bracer, half rye, half ginger ale. He had never been able to take the stuff straight. The liquor helped him. Upstairs and down it helped him, so that he didn't go off the deep end when he went from room to room and found no trace of his wife. The house seemed more than deserted. There was a hollowness in the air, as though even the memory swish of Anne moving about had been sucked up in a vacuum cleaner, right down to the last rustle. He stood at the head of the staircase, mopping his brow and staring down into the darkness. There was a faint scampering down below, and the perfume was still making him reel. "Oh, Anne, what am I going to do? There are Nors in the house, and I'm alone with them." A surge of bitterness went through him. You'd think she'd have left a note for him somewhere in the house. A note. It wasn't until he went into the upstairs bathroom for the second time that he found it, stuck in his shaving mug. With shaking fingers, he pulled it out and read. "Ted, darling, I'll put this in your shaving mug where you'll be sure to find it when you wash up. If today I have vanished like a Rumpelstiltskin away, tomorrow I'll be coming home so fast I'll probably get a ticket. Ted, my neurotic little sister wants me to hold her hand and read to her out of a book, Thorne Smith, if I can find him in the library, while she is having her tonsils removed. So I'm taking the coupe and driving over to East Andover. I'm taking Scotty with me. You'll find some cold roast beef and a bottle of half and half in the refrigerator. Did you sell Jackson the tractor? Your loving Anne." Kendrick moistened his lips. There wasn't anything in the note to cause alarm, even though it failed to dispel the feeling that something ghastly had taken place in his absence. There wasn't a word about hiring an ugly little dwarf to tear up his garden. Not a word about... Something was crawling over the back of Kendrick's hand. It wasn't crawling rapidly, just making a slow snail track between his fingers. Something scratchy, moist. But so what? There was no screen on the bathroom window, and down below was a lush garden, alive with crawling things. Too, June was the month of beetles, of tumblebugs and ladybugs and weevils with spiny tail feelers. Who would be alarmed? Not you, and you, and you perhaps, but Kendrick had never before encountered an invisible bug. He leaped back with a startled cry, jarring a box of dusting powder off the bathroom shelf and sending it crashing to the floor. In little flakes, the talcum settled down over the bugs. There were several of them crawling up Kendrick's legs, and the white powder made them visible. Aside from the horns, which sprouted from both sides of their conical heads, they looked a little like silvery-textured carpet bugs, grown fat and sluggish from feeding on stale plush. In a garden like this, you gotta expect shants and digleys. Something was cruising around inside Kendrick's clothes. The bugs had evidently mistaken him for a flowering plant. The floor was slippery with them now, and they kept dropping down from the ceiling and getting into his hair. A man with courage and willpower enough to look facts in the face would never have acted the way Kendrick did. Instead of letting dismay overwhelm him, such a man would have realized that a garden which had been hardened off by a vanishing dwarf would logically attract insects cut from the same cloth. But Kendrick was like everyone else rather than such a man. He choked and started for the door, his temples pounding. The door opened just as he reached it, swung in toward him, and almost knocked him down. The man who had put his full weight on the door was quite the ugliest brute that Kendrick had ever seen. Heavy-jowled, slow-eyed, and pockmarked by acne, he stood blinking at Kendrick in consternation, his shoulders blocking off the hallway and casting a bulky shadow on the bathtub and another fixture which might have justified his barging in so hastily had he not disclaimed all interest in it. "My mistake, chum," he muttered. "I was looking for the little guy. I thought maybe he'd be in here. He's supposed to have something for me, a bowl of fruit I gotta eat, right out of the garden. You ain't seen him, have you, chum?" "Well, right out of the garden, chum. Don't ask me what kind of fruit. I wouldn't know, and I ain't curious, see? The Judy says I should see the little guy. Apples, plums, peaches, what's the diff? To get out of this lousy clink, I'd eat one of them there patty-tailed rats. Something was scampering up and down the hall, but Kendrick scarcely heard it. The Judy is kind of pretty, but she won't stand for no just you and me stuff. Not that dame. She acted like she owned the clink. Here's my gardener, she says. When you see him and eat, you'll see Scarpati, on account of he's only been dead a week. The big fellow had twisted his head sideways, perhaps unintentionally. Boy, that's a hot one. I'm going to see Scarpati, a week after I stick a shiv in him. Kendrick was staring at the little round black hole in the big fellow's right temple. There was no blood, but the hole had unmistakably been made by a bullet working in. You! Kendrick choked. His knees had turned to jelly, and there was a howling inside his skull. You shouldn't be alive! The big fellow frowned. That's what the Judy said. She steered me over to the mirror, and showed me this here rod crease. I gotta admit she had me scared for a minute, chum, but I'm still around, ain't I? It has to be a gag. Yes, Kendrick heard himself saying, it has to be a gag. Chum, you sure you ain't seen him? Chum, I'm dead, but it has to be a gag. I've a bullet in my brain, but a living dead man is not one iota, jot, atom more shocking than a garden you didn't plant and chance in your pants. No more shocking, no more hideous, all things considered. Kendrick sat staring out the window of a speeding taxi at skewerwood trees in full, luscious bloom. It was still a bright June day, but there was no beauty coming out of it for him now. He had brushed past the big fellow, torn down the stairs, rushed out hatless into the street, and hailed a passing cab. One thought uppermost in his mind. He must see Ralph Middleton before anything more turned up to push him further along toward... He let his thoughts trail off. "Where to, buddy?" asked the driver, twisting his head around. "I told you, didn't I?" "No, buddy, you just said I should drive around." "Oh, the number is 65 River Street." "Okay." Kendrick was shaking like a leaf when he descended in front of Middleton's 3-story frame house and paid the driver off. For one whirling instant, he thought he had come to the wrong address. There was an air of desertion about the place which would have made itself felt even without such disheartening manifestations of non-tenancy as drawn blinds on all the windows, and the fact that someone had removed the little black sign which told the town in modest lettering that Middleton was a practicing psychiatrist, hours 1 to 3, Sundays by appointment. But that air, elusive, indefinable, had apparently started off for some other place, lost its way, and strayed into the wrong pew, for no sooner had the cab drawn away from the curb than Middleton appeared on the front lawn, his face gleaming with sweat. He had come out from behind the porch, but so abruptly that Kendrick was taken aback. The illusion that Middleton had materialized out of thin air was so strong that it wasn't dispelled until the psychiatrist reached his side and thumped him affectionately on the shoulder. "Well, I'll be damned," Middleton said. "I was just thinking about you." Kendrick gulped. "Ralph, Say, this is really a break. I was afraid I'd have to leave without saying goodbye to my best and oldest friend." "You mean you're breaking up?" "Look, old man, come into the house and I'll tell you all about it. Funny thing, I was nailing down the cellar door over my garden hose, and that lawnmower your firm sold me last month, and feeling sadder than hell. In a couple of months, this place is going to look like the devil." Silently, Kendrick accompanied Middleton into the house, and waited while he turned on the hall lamp and brushed dust from his clothes. "Mrs. Graham has just finished putting old-fashioned nightshirts on the furniture," he said. "The place looks like a morgue." "That's all right, Ralph." "Well, come into the library, and we'll have a couple of whiskey sodas." In the library, Middleton seated himself on a sheet-covered sofa and motioned Kendrick to a chair that looked a little like a broken-down ghost. Ted, what would you say if I told you I'd grabbed off a job at the Riverdale Clinic in New York, which will put me up in front? Of course, a man under 30 can't expect—" "That's swell," Kendrick said, moistening his lips. "Hey, just a minute. Give me a chance to tell you." Kendrick leaned forward, clasping his hands over his knees and trying hard to keep his face from breaking loose from its moorings and floating up over his scalp. "I'm in serious trouble," he said. I'm afraid it's in your department, Ralph." Middleton raised quizzical blue eyes and stared at him levelly. "You mean you want to consult me professionally, Ted?" Kendrick's eyes told him yes, yes, yes. He leaned still farther forward, clasping and unclasping his hands and shifting about in his seat. "Well, let's have it," Middleton said. Mostly while Kendrick talked, Middleton remained in one position, but once while Kendrick was loosening his collar, he uncrossed his legs and put the toes of his right foot behind his left ankle. "So you see," Kendrick concluded, "I've got all the symptoms of, well, something I'd hope you'd assure me I haven't got. But while I've been talking to you, I've been jockeying myself into a position which I'm not going to retreat from. It's the strong position of accepting the worst and fighting back from there. You see what I mean?" Middleton nodded approvingly. "I see perfectly, but you're taking all this much too seriously. If ever there was a clear-cut example of what Freud means when he speaks of the ingenuity of the id—" "I'm afraid I don't." Middleton rose, walked to the bookcase behind him, removed a leather-bound volume, and returned to where Kendrick was sitting. Without a word, he put the book into Kendrick's hands. It was Swinburne's Poems and Ballads. "The last time you were over here, you spent the whole evening chanting those Victorian limericks," he said. "Swinburne was a little boy who never grew up, an alliterative jackanapes with verbal meningitis. I'd trade in a dozen of the likes of him for one Shelley, but every man to his taste." "Well?" "Well, turn to page 86, The Garden of Proserpine. You were reading that last month. Wait, don't turn. I'll quote from memory. 'Pale beyond porch and portal, crowned with calm leaves she stands, who gathers all things mortal with cold, immortal hands.' You see, she has a garden, Proserpine has, daughter of Zeus and Demeter. What kind of garden? A garden of death. When people die, they are supposed to walk into that garden and never come out. From too much love of living, from hope and fear set free, we thank with brief thanksgiving, whatever gods may be, that no life lasts forever, that dead men rise up never, that even the wariest river winds somewhere safe to sea." "But I—" "Get it? In your mind, you have a clear, sparkling picture of Proserpine's garden and her bowl of fruit." "Bowl of fruit?" "All right, your conscious mind is a bit rusty on the uptake. But you've read The Golden Bough, and you're subconsciously aware that persons who have found their way into Hades can return to the upper world if they have not tasted the fruit from Proserpine's garden. It comes pretty close to being a universal human myth. If you don't believe me, ask a primitive blackfellow from Australia, or a Caledonian witch-doctor. The Greek variant is the most familiar, but to find the prototype of that grim little Vorstellung, you'd have to sit down to tea with Mr. and Mrs. Piltdown. You taste the fruit, and you are altogether dead. She waits for each and other, she waits for all men born." So what happens? You come back from a nerve-wracking business trip with your head in a whirl. You've been trying to sell tractors to guys who are being paid by the government to plow under their farms. The trip has been a flop, but you've a mental picture of yourself relaxing in dressing gown and slippers, with Anne smoothing the wrinkles out of your forehead with her cool, immortal hands. But Anne isn't there. Old Lady Frustration is waiting for you instead, with a rolling pin cradled in her arms. She swings at you, and you reel. You're so groggy, your reading comes back to you, the verses from Swinburne, Fraser's Golden Bough. You go out into the garden, and everything blurs. You see a garden that isn't there. Her garden, Proserpine's, with cold, immortal hands. You see a dwarf she's hired to do the menial work, seeding, pruning, bringing in the sheaves. Demonomania, you understand. Dwarfs, little devils with forked tails, leprechauns, blue-bottle imps are all symptomatic of demonomania, and sometimes you have an insect aura. You don't have to worry, though. It isn't a psychosis, just neuroticism raised to high C, a phobia, and you've got to remember that you can sometimes have the crawling things without a clear-cut symptomology. But how about the big ape with a bullet hole in his temple? Kendrick asked. The horror was lifting now. Miraculously, it was being dispelled by the astonishing psychiatrist vistas which Middleton was unrolling with the deftness of a genie warmed by wine. Why, don't you see? You brought Proserpine's garden into your home because you had a peg to hang it on. He was the peg. You imagined the garden growing up around him. When did the police notify you, by the way? Involuntarily, Kendrick stiffened, his lips whitening as he returned the psychiatrist's stare. Huh? The police? What are you talking about? It was Middleton's turn to evince agitation. You mean to say you didn't know? Kendrick shook his head. Why, I thought, of course, the police would get in touch with you. No reason to, I suppose, except that, well, it gave your wife a nasty jolt, and she may have to appear in court. I should think. But wait a minute. Of course, they took it for granted that Anne would wire you. Kendrick was shaking now in every limb. The vista had stopped unrolling, was buckling into wormy folds. Something was crawling up his back, too, inching along his spine. What is it? He demanded hoarsely. Ted, I'm your friend. You've got to remember that. You must have known, which suggests a case history going back for some time, rather than a momentary phobia brought on by strain. You must have known and forgotten that you knew, subconsciously building up the garden to torture yourself before you arrived home. It's a little more serious than I thought. In heaven's name, man, spit it out! Well, here is what you really know, Ted, deep in your mind. You know that night before last, a thug named Spike Malone held up a jewelry store on Elmhurst Boulevard, fled along Carter Street, and ducked into your backyard when the police closed in on him from 3 sides. He was shot twice, once in the right temple, once in the hip. You mean he died in my garden? Kendrick choked. No, he didn't die. They rushed him to Stonington Hospital. For all I know, he may still be alive. It can happen, you know, if the bullet passes down through the gyrus ling. Kendrick's face seemed all wrenched apart. Anne did not wire me, he said. Oh, come now, you must have known. I tell you she didn't. You've got to be careful not to contradict me. Middleton turned pale. Now look here, old man, there isn't a thing I wouldn't do for you. I'm your friend, the very best you have in the world. I'm postponing New York, because that's the very least I can do, and only the beginning of— He came back to die, Kendrick groaned. He was mortally wounded, and now he's eating the fruit. Oh, come now, I've explained all that. You've explained it too well. Stark anguish looked out of Kendrick's eyes. I believe in that garden now, Middleton. I believe in it. Middleton seemed not to hear him. He was squirming about in his seat and scratching himself, as though he had been suddenly assailed by a legion of ticks. Abruptly, as Kendrick stared, the psychiatrist's jaw jigged downward, and his lips began to jerk. Convulsively, to squirm and jerk, as though all the words which he had uttered were rushing frantically back into his mouth. Anne Kendrick drew into the curb beneath skewerwood trees in full luscious bloom, humming I'm Mad at the Moon, 'cause the moon won't talk. She silenced the car's throbbing motor, lifted an all-night bag over the back seat, and descended to the sidewalk with her skirts fluttering up about her knees. She moved buoyantly across the sidewalk and into the shadow of the house. She glanced up, smiling, and for an instant thought of calling out, Ted, darling, I'm back. But no, better to slip quietly into the house and surprise him. He'd probably be in the library, out and back, reading or making out his monthly sales report, and entirely oblivious to sounds from the street. The fragrance surprised her even before she got the door open, filling the vestibule with the sweetness which made her choke. She thought. Lucky I'm not Katy with her tonsils wrapped in gauze. Katy wouldn't like all that fragrance, you can bet. Young girl, she thought, you're home again, and in a moment you'll be in the arms of a pretty nice chap. All things considered, a husband to be proud of, and a worthwhile addition to any woman's house. Her key clicked in the lock. Still humming, she stepped into the lower hallway and set her bag down at the foot of the stairs. The fragrance was really something. It filled her with a vague uneasiness suddenly, so that she ceased to smile. Now what had Ted done? Gone down to the dime store and bought a novelty plant, one of those yellow African air orchids that were supposed to bloom overnight. You put the orchid in a bowl, dry, and it was supposed to draw nourishment from the air and really blossom out. Would such a plant have an odor like that? Down the hall she tiptoed, telling herself that she was not going to allow a mere odor to spoil her homecoming. The library was hushed and dark, but there was an air of recent occupancy in the room which dispelled her unreasoning dread until she heard someone say, not loudly, but with a menacing inflection that chilled her heart like ice, "You're gonna eat, see? Just because you find a sherm in this here apple ain't no reason for refusing to put on the feed bag. You're keeping these gentlemen waiting." "To hell with them," said a second voice. "I ain't gonna eat no pink maggots." A third voice interposed. "Very curious. He is compensating for a malignant inferiority complex even now. Blustering, putting on an act." "You see, this gentleman is a sick eye a twist. He knows what you are. He's got you dead to rights." "You may as well eat, Spike," said a fourth voice. "You're going out into the garden, and you're not coming back." "That's what you think, chum." "I don't think. I know. We're all in this together." "I don't see why you have to eat, chum." "I don't either, Spike, but I do. I was having a quiet little talk with Dr. Middleton on the other side of town when we both realized we would have to eat too. Spike, somehow I feel very sorry for you. You're a social menace, but it wasn't your fault exactly. All your life, something inside you has felt kicked around. Of every million lives, how many a score are failures from their birth?" "You'd better stick to Swinburne, Ted," the third voice said. "He wasn't as great as Shelley, but sometimes he hit the nail on the head. And all dead years draw hither, and all disastrous things." "So you're poets, eh? I gotta eat with a couple of rhyme-spoutin', wrist-slappin' poets." "No, Spike, we're not poets. This gentleman is a psychiatrist, and I sell farm implements." Anne had turned as pale as death. The voices were right in the room with her. Her husband's voice was the loudest, Dr. Middleton's fainter but vibrant, the man called Spike gruff but extremely faint. Suddenly she heard a crunching sound, followed by an angry grunt. "You call this an orange?" "Sure it's an orange," said the first voice. "I grew it myself. A blue, bitter-rind orange. What you complaining about?" "Nothing much, just that this ain't my idea of an orange. Here, little squirt, I ought to cram it down your throat." "You better eat, fella. You put it off too long, and you'll be gagging on a funnel drip." Crunch, crunch. "You're got a lot to learn about fruit growing, Squirt. If I wasn't so set on getting out of this mangy clink." There was a scraping sound, as though a chair had been pushed back by someone getting up. "He's gone," Ted's voice said. "You mean he's going," the first voice amended. "You can't see him now, but he's walking out into the garden." There was a momentary hush. Then Dr. Middleton's voice said, "Well, am I next?" "You are, buddy," said the first voice. "What'll it be? For a gentleman like you, I recommend a bunch of very hollow grapes." "I have never liked grapes," Middleton said. "I'll take a peach." There was another crunch. "He ate that like a man," the first voice said. "Give me the bowl," Ted's voice groaned. "I'll take a... Oh, Anne, darling, if you could just see her, buddy, you'd be sweating buckets." "What do you mean?" "Buddy, take a look at yourself. You want her to look like that?" Ted's voice groaned. Buddy, giving advice is out of my line, but if my wife didn't have to eat, I wouldn't ask to see her. No use giving the 3 spinning sisters ideas. You see what I mean? I see what you mean. The people I can see are going to die. Oh, don't. The first voice quivered as though in pain. They just have to eat, that's all. Don't use that word again, buddy. I drove over to Middleton's place in a cab, Ted's voice said. I saw the driver. He's going to eat too, buddy, but he don't know it yet. His pump is missing every second beat. I see. And Middleton was... The drawn blinds. You're smart, buddy. Middleton was in New York, driving around in your car. His house here is shut up tight. But I sat in his library and talked to him, not 20 minutes ago. Sure you did, buddy. You both came home to eat. Where could you find a better garden? I've been working over it just for you 3 guys. The big guy was shot here. And you, this is your home. She figured 3 together like that, all from the same town, ought to sit down at the same table. Smart, eh? Saves time and trouble. Suddenly, a new voice spoke, coldly, austerely, as though from a great height. Eat now! You have talked enough! Hiya, goddess, Kendrick's voice said. It was taught with anguish, but Kendrick had always vowed he would go with the jest. It was something he had thrashed out with himself in his 14th year. I'll take a plum, he said. Fortunately, I can see the fruit. The bowl is a little misty around the edges, but it isn't invisible. I couldn't see the Shants and Digleys, but this plum... The first voice gasped. You couldn't see the Shants? Not until I spilled some dusting powder on them, Kendrick said. Could you see the Nors? No. Buddy, look, you walk out into that garden pulling a gag, and you'll wish you were never born. I didn't see the Nors, Kendrick reiterated. Now, if you don't mind, I'll... Do not eat, said the high, austere voice. Mistress, it's just a gag. The car turned over 3 times. He must not eat. Make up your mind, Kendrick almost screamed. The austere voice said, I can see him now. He is sitting up in bed. He is asking for his wife. There is a doctor and a nurse standing beside him. The nurse is smiling. You little worm, I ought to have you thrashed. It wasn't my fault, mistress. I swear it wasn't my fault. He had a temperature of 106. 2 faces, a man's and a woman's, appeared simultaneously in the room, one on a level with Anne's eyes, and the other high up under the ceiling. The woman's face was thick-lipped, negroid, and crowned with a circlet of gleaming flowers. The man, Anne caught her breath, was regarding her tenderly. He was trying hard to smile, Ted was. She could see his body now, mistily, and the outlines of a table, and a pot-bellied little figure, scarcely 3 feet tall, with a bowl of fruit in his hands. Down from the woman's face streamed a long, flowing robe. She was stooping a little now, and her eyes were wide, staring. Suddenly, as Anne swayed, they seemed to fill the room. 2 enormous orbs, mirroring metal-gray skies, and a waste of tumbled sand that seemed to stretch out endlessly in all directions. In the depths of the sky, vultures wheeled, and for an instant there was a carrion taint in the room. Then the eyes grew small again. There was a glimmer of purple light, and faces, table, and bowl of fruit dwindled to luminous motes, which darted about for an instant in the shadowed, quiet room, and were suddenly gone. Long-distance calling, Mrs. Kendrick, Mrs. Kendrick, Kendrick. This is long-distance calling. Here is your party, sir. Hello, Ted. Ted, oh, my darling, my poor dear. Anne, hold on tight. I've had an accident, but I'm all right now, and you've got to stay steady. I wouldn't be phoning and talking in a calm, quiet way if I wasn't all right. You realize that, don't you? I know, darling, I know. I've been unconscious for 26 hours, but now they're going to give me something to eat. I'm sitting up, and the nurse on duty here is holding my hand, and I'm telling myself it's your hand I'm holding. I'm not jealous, darling. Dear, I tried to play Good Samaritan. Yesterday I dropped in at the Riverdale Clinic to see how Middleton was standing the gaff. He wasn't standing it so well. He said he felt like chucking the new job and going back to Limbrook. He looked so played out, I suggested 18 holes of golf and a spin on the Bronx River Parkway. We were leaving Grassy Sprain when a road skunk came out from behind a truck and pushed me off the road.
Ted, please hold the wire, just for a second. I don't feel so...
Anne, are you all right? Anne, answer me.
Gulpolo. Yes, I feel better now. Ted, darling.
You sure? You want me to hold the wire while you get something?
No, dear. I've got something right here. A straight brandy.
Anne, this may sound sort of screwy, but is our garden all right?
Yes, it is, Ted. I was just out there.
I must have been delirious all last night. I thought...
I know, Ted, darling, but we've got our own beautiful garden back now.
Your time is up, sir. Operator, listen, this is an emergency call.
His time is not up, operator. He is going to live to be 106. I don't know what's in store for you, but he's going to grow old along with me. Park that with your gum and step back from the line, young lady.